In January of 1888, a rescue team rode across the Dakota Prairie, expecting to find a dead family. They had already seen three that morning. A Norwegian mother frozen 10 feet from her own door. A farmer curled beside a cold iron stove. A young couple holding each other in bed faces, peaceful bodies turned to stone. So, when they reached the tar paper cabin of a German-Russian widow and saw no smoke rising from the chimney, not a single thread of gray against the white sky, they knew what they would find inside. Another tragedy. Another family lost to the worst blizzard the American frontier had ever seen. They dug through 4 feet of snow and forced the door open. And warm air hit their frozen faces like the breath of July. 3 children were playing on a heated floor. Rye bread was baking in the corner. And in the center of that tiny cabin stood an enormous clay stove, radiating a gentle, steady warmth, as though the blizzard outside had never mattered at all. The woman had no firewood, no coal, no iron stove, no money. 40 below zero outside, and the ground beneath her children's bare feet was warm enough to sleep on. One of the men knelt beside the warm floor and whispered a single word. How? The answer began 6 months earlier. In a season of dust and grief with a widow, $47, and a memory she carried across an ocean. The men who rowed toward the tar paper cabin on the morning of January 15th, 1888, believed they were riding toward the dead. They had seen enough death already. 3 homesteads visited since dawn. 3 families found in the positions where the cold had finally taken them. A Norwegian mother frozen 10 feet from her own door. Her infant son still clutched against her chest. Both of them turned to something that was no longer human, but not yet stone. A bachelor farmer curled beside his iron stove. The stove cold, the ashes cold. The man cold, his fingers still wrapped around the handle of a firewood box that held nothing but splinters and despair. A young couple in a soddy north of the creek holding each other in bed. The blankets pulled to their chins. Their faces peaceful in a way that only the deeply frozen can be peaceful. As though the cold had whispered them to sleep and then simply never let them wake. So when Lars Eriksson and his 3-man rescue party crested the low ridge east of the Steinhardt claim and saw the tar paper shack sitting alone in a white ocean of snow, no smoke rising from the tin chimney pipe, no tracks around the door, no sign of life in any direction. Not one of them expected to find anything but more of the same. Eriksson was a tall man with a Scandinavian jaw and eyes that had learned to look at hard things without blinking. He had buried his own brother in the winter of '83. He knew what cold could do to a body and what finding those bodies could do to the men who found them. He pulled his scarf tighter and nodded to the others. "Dig out the door," he said. The snow had drifted 4 feet high against the south wall. 2 men worked with shovels while the third held the horses. The scraping sound was the only noise in a world that had gone perfectly, terribly still. No wind, no birdsong, no creak of timber. Just the shovels and the breathing of men who were trying not to think about what waited on the other side. When they cleared enough to push the door, it stuck. Frozen at the hinges, sealed by ice, held shut by something more than weather. One of the men put his shoulder into it. The wood groaned. Then it gave. And warm air came out. Not a whisper of warmth. not the fading memory of a fire that had burned hours ago. Warm air, rich and soft, pushed against their frozen faces like the breath of July. Erickson stepped back. He looked at the chimney again. No smoke. He looked at the doorway. Warm air still pouring out, visible now in the frozen morning, rising in soft clouds against the blue sky. He stepped inside. The floor was warm beneath his boots. Not just free of frost, not just tolerable, but warm enough to sit on, warm enough to sleep on, warm enough to press your hand against and feel something close to comfort, radiating up through the packed earth. 3 children played on that warm floor. A girl of about 11 sat in the corner mending a sock with careful, precise stitches. A boy of 8 lay on his stomach drawing shapes in the dust, with his finger occasionally coughing into his sleeve, but alert, alive, present. A small girl of 5, maybe younger, sat cross-legged near a massive white structure in the center of the room, humming a tune that none of the men recognized. A tune that did not belong to this continent, and beside that structure a woman stood. She was not tall. She was not young. Her hands were rough and cracked and red, the hands of a person who had worked harder in the last 6 months than most people work in a decade. Her hair was pulled back tight, her face lean, her eyes the color of river clay. And in those eyes was something that Lars Erickson had never seen before in all his years on the Dakota prairie. She was calm, not the calm of shock, not the calm of surrender. The calm of a woman who had built something that worked and knew it worked, and had spent 3 days inside a blizzard that killed hundreds of people across 4 states, and had never once doubted that she and her children would survive. She was baking rye bread. Erickson looked at the white structure. It was enormous, nearly filling the center of the tiny cabin, a great rectangular mass of whitewashed clay with a firebox at its base and a surface you could press your palms against and feel heat stored deep within it. Heat that had no visible source, no flame, no ember, no glowing coal. Just heat, living inside the clay like a heartbeat. He had never seen anything like it. "How?" he whispered. The woman did not understand the word, but she understood the look in his eyes. She had been seeing that look for months, from neighbors, from the land agent, from every American who had watched her haul clay from the creek bank and shape bricks in the August sun and build something that none of them believed in. The look said the same thing every time. How did a woman with nothing survive what was killing everyone else? The answer to that question began 6 months earlier in a different season, in a different kind of heat, on a road that led to a place where nobody was waiting for her. August of 1887 came to the Dakota Territory the way August always came, with dust, with locusts, with a sun that hammered the prairie flat and turned the grass to straw and made the whole world shimmer at the edges like something not quite real. The wagon that rattled into Freeman on the 14th of that month carried a woman, 3 children, and everything they owned in the world, which was not much. A trunk of clothes, a set of iron cooking pots, a Bible in German, a wooden crate of tools that had belonged to her husband, who had died 17 days earlier in a town in Nebraska whose name she could barely pronounce, a town that had taken her husband's body and given her nothing in return except a burial receipt and the terrible freedom of having no one left to follow. Her name was Katrine Steinhardt. She was 32 years old. She had been born in a German settlement on the Ukrainian steppe, married at 19, sailed to America at 24, and widowed at 32, in a country that still felt foreign on her tongue. Her English was broken, assembled from necessity rather than education, each sentence a small act of construction that cost her effort and pride in equal measure. She had 3 children. Liesl was 11, quiet, watchful, already wearing the expression of someone who understands more than she should. She had her father's jaw and her mother's hands, and a stillness about her that made adults uneasy, the way a child who has stopped being surprised by hardship makes everyone around her aware of how much hardship there has been. Fritz was 8, thin, bright-eyed, plagued by a cough that had followed him from Nebraska like a stray dog that would not be chased away. He coughed in the morning, coughed at night, coughed when the dust rose and when the air went still. The cough had started as a small thing, a catch in the throat, a clearing of the chest. But it had deepened over the weeks on the road, and Katrine heard in it something she did not yet allow herself to name. Annie was 5. She had yellow hair and fast legs and a habit of wandering toward anything that moved. Butterflies, prairie dogs, the distant shapes of antelope on the horizon. She was the one Katrine had to watch most carefully, not because she was fragile, but because she did not yet understand that the world was a place where wandering could get you killed. They arrived in Freeman with $47. Katrine had earned it slowly, painfully, over the 17 days since Johann's death. She had sold his tools, his pocket watch, the good boots he had worn on Sundays. She had sold the horse because she could not afford to feed it, and the saddle because she could not bear to look at it. She had kept only what could not be converted into coins, the cooking pots, the clothes, the Bible, the memories. Everything else had been rendered into that thin stack of bills that she kept folded in a cloth pouch against her ribs, where she could feel it with every breath. A reminder that she was not yet destitute, not yet at the bottom, not yet out of numbers. $47. In the summer of 1887 on the Dakota frontier, $47 was enough to starve slowly instead of quickly. The land office in Freeman was a single room with a plank counter, and a man behind it who smelled like tobacco and indifference. His name was Colton Whitfield, and he had the particular talent of certain government men for making you feel like a problem to be processed rather than a person to be helped. He glanced at Katrine's homestead papers, glanced at her children, glanced at the clock on the wall. Quarter section 12 miles northeast, he said. Previous claimant abandoned it after 1 winter. Improvements on site include a tar paper cabin approximately 12 by 14 feet. Iron stove condition unknown. He stamped the papers without looking up. You have 5 years to prove up. Sincerely, good luck. He did not sound sincere. The ride to the claim took most of a day. The children slept in the back of the wagon while Katrine drove her eyes fixed on a landscape that offered nothing to fix them on. Flat, brown, endless. The grass moved in the wind like water, and sometimes she could see for so many miles in every direction that the horizon seemed to curve, as though the earth were reminding her how small she was. The cabin appeared late in the afternoon, and the sight of it nearly broke her. It stood alone on a low rise, a squat rectangle of rough lumber wrapped in tar paper, so thin that in places the afternoon light came through it like lace. The door hung on leather hinges, one window covered in oiled paper, instead of glass, faced south. The roof was sod already sagging, in the middle already growing weeds that waved in the breeze like small surrendering flags. Inside was worse. A dirt floor packed hard, but uneven, already cracked from the summer heat. A single iron stove in the corner, the kind that cost $4 new, and this one was not new. A crack ran along the firebox like a scar, and when Katrine knelt beside it and peered inside, she could see daylight through the seam. A stove that could not hold heat, walls that could not hold wind, a roof that could not hold rain. This was what the land had given her. This was where she was supposed to build a life. Liesl stood in the doorway holding Annie's hand, looking at the interior with an expression that was too old for her face. "Is this it?" she asked in German. Katrine straightened. She pressed her hand flat against the tar paper wall. It flexed inward under her palm, thin as a drumhead, thin as a promise that no one intended to keep. "Yes," she said. "This is it." The first neighbor came the next morning. Silas Dawson rode up on a bay horse with a white blaze, a man of perhaps 50, with a gray beard and deep-set eyes that looked like they had been carved into his face by years of squinting at things he did not want to see. He had homesteaded 6 miles south, one of the few claims in the area that had survived more than 2 winters. He had earned that survival the hard way. His daughter Clara, age 4, had died in the winter of '81. Pneumonia that started as a cough and ended as a grave marker that the snow buried every December and the spring uncovered every April. Like a wound that the earth itself refused to let heal. He rode up and sat on his horse for a long moment, watching Katrine unload the wagon. She was stacking the cooking pots near the door, moving with the efficient, practiced motions of a woman who had moved too many times to waste energy on anything that did not need doing. "Ma'am," he said. She looked up, shielded her eyes from the sun. "My name is Silas Dawson. I live south of here." He pointed. 6 miles. She nodded. "Katrine," she said. "Steinhardt." He looked at the cabin. He looked at the stovepipe poking through the sod roof at an angle that was not quite right. He looked at the tar paper walls, and something shifted in his face. Something that was not quite pity, and not quite anger, but lived in the space between them, where helplessness lives. "You cannot winter here," he said. Katrine wiped her hands on her apron. "How much wood?" she asked. Silas dismounted. He walked to the cabin wall and pressed his hand against it, the same way she had done the day before. The paper flexed. He shook his head. "Look, 8 cords minimum," he said. 10 to be sure. That stove is cracked, which means it burns fast and leaks heat. You will go through wood like water." He paused. "Hauling from the river breaks costs $2 a cord if you can find a man with a wagon. That is $16 to $20 for the wood alone. Then you need to patch these walls, and I mean really patch them, not just tar paper, but sod banked up the sides at least 3 feet. And you need food stores, flour, salt, pork, dried beans enough for 5 months, because once the snow comes, you are not going anywhere." Each number he spoke pushed her further from survival. "How much?" she said again. "All of it. How much?" Silas did the arithmetic in his head. She watched his lips move. 8 cords of wood. $16. Wall improvements. Food. Medicine because he had seen the boy coughing and he knew what Dakota winters did to weak lungs. $50, he said, at least. Probably more. She had 35. She had spent $12 on the journey from Nebraska on food and wagon repair, and a new shoe for the mule that had since been sold. $35 left. $15 short of survival. And that was the optimistic number, the number that assumed nothing went wrong. And on the Dakota frontier, something always went wrong. Silas saw the math hit her. He saw it the way you see a fence post. Take a heavy wind, the slight lean, the held breath, the question of whether it will stay standing. There are other options, he said carefully. The county has a fund for relocation. You could go back to Nebraska. Or there is a boarding house in Freeman where you and the children could stay through winter. It is not free, but it is not $50 either. And my claim, you would lose it. He said it simply because there was no gentle way to say it. Whitfield would mark it abandoned. Someone else would file. Katrin looked at the cabin. She looked at the cracked stove. She looked at the sod roof with its small waving flags of surrender. She looked at all of it and felt the weight of everything she did not have pressing down on her shoulders like a yoke. And then, somewhere inside her, in a place deeper than arithmetic and more stubborn than despair, something stirred. It came as a smell first. Wet clay. River mud. The heavy mineral-rich earth of the Ukrainian steppe, dark as coffee, thick as memory. Then it came as a feeling the weight of clay in her hands. The smooth resistance of it under her palms, the way it yielded and held shape at the same time. Like something alive. Then it came as a voice. Oma Brigitte, her grandmother. A woman built from leather and patience, and a kind of practical wisdom that had kept her family alive through winters that made Dakota look hospitable. She had lived in a village on the steppe where the wind blew for 6 months without stopping, and the temperature dropped to numbers that had no meaning to anyone who had not felt them. And in the center of her house, taking up nearly a third of the living space, stood an enormous masonry stove. Katrin remembered it now with a clarity that surprised her, as though the memory had been waiting for exactly this moment to surface. The stove was taller than a man and wider than a bed, built from hand-shaped clay bricks mortared with a mixture of clay and straw and manure that dried harder than stone. Inside it, a maze of smoke channels wound back and forth, a labyrinth designed to extract every whisper of heat from the fire before the smoke finally escaped through the chimney. The firebox was lined with thick clay bricks cured in a kiln until they rang like bells when you tapped them. You lit a fire in it, a fast, hot fire, 20 minutes, maybe 30. Straw-dried grass, sunflower stalks, even cattle dung, anything that burned hot and quick. And then the fire died. And then the magic happened. The thick clay walls absorbed the heat. All of it. Hundreds of degrees of thermal energy sucked into the dense mass of earth and held there the way a river stone holds the warmth of a summer afternoon long after the sun is set. And then slowly, hour after hour, the walls radiated that heat back into the room. 20 hours, sometimes more. The floor stayed warm. The walls stayed warm. The air stayed warm. Even when the wind outside was trying to tear the roof off, even when the temperature fell to numbers that killed livestock and froze water in the bucket beside your bed. Katrine had helped build one when she was 16 years old. She remembered the work, the digging, the mixing, the shaping of bricks, hundreds of them, each one formed by hand and laid in the sun to dry. The stacking course by course, the channels measured by handspan, the angles checked by eye, because there were no levels, no squares, no tools designed for the purpose. Just experience passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, like a language that had no alphabet. A language written in clay and remembered in the hands. She remembered the day the stove was finished. Oma Brigitte had pressed her palm against the whitewashed surface and held it there for a long moment, her eyes closed, her lips moving in something that was not quite prayer. "This is how our people cheat the cold," she had said. "The fire burns for 20 minutes. The clay remembers for 20 hours. The stove does not fight the winter. It outlasts it." But Katrine also remembered something else. Something she had spent 16 years trying not to think about. The second stove, the one she had tried to build herself. She was 16, almost 17, and proud of what she had learned. A family in the next village needed a stove. Katrine volunteered. She mixed the clay, shaped the bricks, built the firebox, laid the channels. She did everything the way she remembered every step, every angle, every proportion. But when they lit the first fire, the smoke did not rise through the channels the way it was supposed to. Instead, it pooled in the third channel, backed up and poured into the room through every crack and seam. Within minutes, the house was blind with smoke. The family stumbled out, coughing eyes, burning children screaming. Katrine stood in the yard and watched the smoke pour from the doorway and felt a shame so deep it was physical, a weight in her chest that she would carry for years. Oma Brigitte came. She examined the stove without a word. Then she found the problem. The third channel. The turn was too sharp. The smoke could not make the bend, so it backed up like water behind a dam. Brigitte dismantled the section, rebuilt the angle wider, smoother with a gentle curve, instead of a hard corner. She made it look easy. She made everything look easy. "Remember this," she said, her hands still covered in wet clay. "The smoke must never be forced. It must be invited. Build the path and the smoke will follow. Force the path and the smoke will fight you." Then she looked at Katrine with eyes that held no judgment, but held something worse, a kind of knowing. "Remember this well, Katrine. Next time I may not be here to fix it." 6 months later, Brigitte was dead. A fever that came fast and left faster, taking with it the woman who knew more about clay and fire and survival than anyone Katrine had ever known. Taking with it the teacher, leaving behind a student who had failed her only solo examination. Katrine had never built a stove alone since, not because she had forgotten how, because she was afraid of getting it wrong again, afraid of the smoke, afraid of the failure, afraid that without Oma's hands to guide her, her own hands were not enough. Now, standing in a tar paper cabin in Dakota Territory, with $35 and 3 children, and a cracked iron stove, and a winter coming that would kill anyone who was not ready for it. The memory of that failure rose up inside her, alongside the memory of Oma Brigitte's voice, and the two memories stood face to face like opponents in a ring, and Katrine understood that one of them would have to win. She looked at Silas Dawson. "How much clay," she said, "is in the creek bank?" He blinked. What? The creek, east of here. The bank is clay, yes, how much? Silas stared at her. He understood the question. He did not understand why she was asking it. Clay was dirt. Clay was what you cursed when your plow blade struck it. Clay was what stuck to your boots in the spring and cracked in the summer, and turned to soup in the rain. Nobody asked about clay the way this woman was asking about clay, with hunger in her voice and calculation in her eyes. "There is plenty," he said slowly. "But what do you want with clay?" "I am going to build a stove," she said. He waited for the rest of the sentence. There was no rest. "A stove," he repeated, "out of clay. My grandmother built them. In the old country. They burn straw, grass, dung, anything. The fire is small and fast. The clay holds the heat. 20 hours, sometimes more." Silas looked at the cracked iron stove in the corner. He looked at the tar paper walls. He looked at this woman, this widow, this immigrant with broken English and 3 children and $35 standing in a cabin that the previous owner had abandoned after a single winter, telling him that she was going to survive a Dakota winter with a pile of mud. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that this was not the old country, that Dakota cold was a different animal, that prairie blizzards were not. Steppe blizzards, that what worked in Ukraine would not work here. But something in her face stopped him. Not desperation. He had seen desperation many times, and it was not this. This was something quieter and harder and older than desperation. This was the face of a woman who had already done the math, already counted the distance between survival and death, and already chosen which direction she was going to walk. "I hope you are right," he said. He mounted his horse. He looked down at her one more time, and then he said something that he would regret for the rest of his life. Not because it was cruel, but because it was the kind of truth that does not help anyone. "If you are wrong," he said, "you will not be the first to die out here, but your children will be the youngest." He rode away. Katrin watched him go. She stood there until the dust settled and the sound of hooves faded, and the prairie was silent again. That immense and pitiless silence that swallowed every human sound and gave nothing back. Then she turned to the cabin. Liesel stood in the doorway watching her. "Mama," Liesel said in German. "What are we going to do?" Katrin knelt. She took her daughter's hands. They were small and rough and already showing the calluses of a child who had been working alongside adults for too long. "We are going to build something," Katrin said. "Something your great-grandmother taught me. And we are going to build it before the cold comes. Will it work?" Katrin hesitated. The honest answer was that she did not know. The honest answer was that she had tried once and failed. The honest answer was that the woman who could have told her whether it would work was dead and buried on a steppe 4,000 miles and 16 years away. But honesty, she had learned, was sometimes a luxury that mothers could not afford. "Yes," she said, "it will work." The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, Katrine walked to the creek. It was a small creek, barely worth the name, a trickle of brown water that wound through a cut in the prairie, about a quarter mile east of the cabin. In the spring, it probably ran fast enough to matter. Now, in August, it was barely ankle deep, slow and warm and thick with sediment. But the banks were what Katrine had come for. She knelt at the edge and pressed her fingers into the exposed wall of earth, where the water had cut a clean cross-section through the soil. The top layer was grass and roots tangled and dry. Below that, 3 inches of sandy soil. And below that, clay, red-brown clay, dense, heavy, cool to the touch even in August. She pulled a handful free and worked it between her palms, feeling the texture, the moisture content, the way it held together without crumbling, the way it yielded without falling apart. She brought it to her nose and smelled it, that deep mineral smell that was the same on every continent, the smell of the earth giving you what you needed if you knew how to ask. It was good clay, not perfect, a little sandy, which meant it would need more straw to bind it, but workable, familiar. Her hands recognized it the way a carpenter's hands recognize wood grain, not through thought but through touch, through years of practice stored in the fingers like a second memory. She went back for the shovel. For the next 3 weeks, Katrine dug clay. She dug it in the morning before the heat became unbearable. She dug it in the evening when the shadows grew long. She carried it in buckets 2 at a time, balanced on a yoke she fashioned from a broken axe handle, and 2 lengths of rope, the weight pulling at her shoulders until the muscles burned and then kept burning, and then went past burning into a place where the body simply does what it is told, because the mind has stopped listening to complaints. She made the trip 14 times a day, a quarter mile there, a quarter mile back, 2 buckets of wet clay each time, roughly 40 pounds per load. 560 pounds a day, nearly 4 tons per week. She dug until her hands blistered, and the blisters broke and the skin beneath them hardened into something that did not blister anymore. Liesl helped. The girl was 11 but strong in the way that frontier children were strong, with a wiry endurance that came from never having known a life that did not require physical labor. She carried smaller buckets, mixed the clay with straw that Katrine cut from the prairie with a hand scythe, turned the mixture with a hoe until it reached the right consistency, the consistency that Katrine tested with her hands and her memory, squeezing and shaping and pressing until it felt the way it was supposed to feel. The way it had felt in Oma Brigitte's yard all those years ago. Fritz tried to help too. He hauled smaller loads, fetched water, gathered dried grass for the straw mixture. But the cough slowed him. Some days it was manageable, a dry catch that came and went. Other days it settled into his chest like a tenant that refused to leave, deep and wet and exhausting. On those days, Katrin made him sit in the shade and rest, which he hated because he was 8 years old. And 8-year-old boys do not understand that rest is sometimes the hardest kind of work. And I helped by staying out of the way, which was its own form of contribution. She chased grasshoppers. She built small towers of clay scraps and knocked them down and built them again. She sang songs in German that she had learned from her father's songs about rivers and mountains and places she would never see. Her small voice floating across the prairie like something that did not belong there, but somehow made it more bearable. Katrine shaped the bricks by hand, each one roughly the size of a loaf of bread, formed in a simple wooden mold that she built from scrap lumber. She mixed the clay with chopped straw and a careful measure of dried cow manure collected from a nearby pasture where someone's cattle had once grazed. The manure served as a binding agent, and when it dried, it turned the bricks into something remarkably strong. stronger than the clay alone, stronger than anyone who had not worked with it would believe. She laid the bricks in rows on the flat ground south of the cabin, where the August sun beat down without mercy, and she left them there to cure. Day after day the rows grew. 20 bricks, 50, 100, 200, 300. They changed color as they dried, shifting from dark red-brown to a lighter tan, and they hardened until you could rap them with your knuckle and hear a solid ringing sound, the sound of something that would hold. The neighbors noticed. Word traveled on the prairie the way everything traveled on the prairie, slowly but inevitably carried by the rare rider passing through, by the women who met at the Freeman General Store, by the men who gathered at the feedlot and talked about weather and wheat prices, and the people who were new to the area, and the people who would probably not last. A woman, a widow, digging clay from the creek bank and making bricks. Hundreds of bricks. Some kind of foreign stove, they said. Some kind of old country contraption. Mud and straw and cow dung to heat a house through a Dakota winter. Most of them laughed. Not all of them, but most. Edna Dawson came on a Tuesday in September. She rode up in a buckboard with her jaw set and her eyes sharp. A woman in her late 40s who had survived 7 Dakota winters and buried a daughter in one of them, and had developed over those years a particular intolerance for what she considered foolishness. She was not cruel. Cruelty requires indifference, and Edna Dawson was anything but indifferent. She cared intensely about the people around her, cared with a fierce and sometimes suffocating energy that expressed itself most often as unsolicited advice delivered with the force of a hammer. She stood beside the rows of drying bricks and looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at Katrine, who was mixing another batch of clay near the creek, her arms coated to the elbows in reddish mud. Mrs. Steinhardt. Katrine straightened. Yes. My husband tells me you intend to heat your home with these. Yes. Edna walked along the rows, her boots clicking against the dry earth. She picked up a brick, turned it over, tapped it with her fingernail. She set it down. I've lived here since 1880, she said. I've seen what winter does. My daughter Clara, she died in the winter of '81. Pneumonia. She was 4 years old. She started coughing in November and she was buried by Christmas. Edna's voice did not waver. She had told this story enough times that the words had been worn smooth, like river stones. The sharp edges ground away by repetition, until what remained was hard and round and permanent. My husband's stove was iron, a good one, the best you could buy in Sioux Falls. $40. And it was not enough. The cold came through the walls and the floor and the gaps around the window, and Clara's lungs could not fight it. She turned to Katrine. You have a boy who coughs. Yes. And you have a stove made of mud. Katrine said nothing. I did not come here to be unkind, Edna said. I came because I have seen what you are building, and I have seen what winter does, and I cannot stand by and watch 3 children walk into something that might kill them when there is another way. What way? Let me take the little one. Annie. Just for the winter. She can stay with us. Our house is solid. Our stove is iron and sound. We have 12 cords of wood already stacked and covered. She will be warm. She will be fed. In the spring, she comes back to you. No papers, no arrangements, no questions. Just one winter. Katrin felt something crack inside her. Not anger. Something deeper than anger. The particular pain of a mother being told gently and with genuine concern that she is not enough. "No," she said. Edna exhaled. She looked at the bricks again. She looked at the tar paper cabin. She looked at the sky, which was still summer blue, but carried in its light the first faint suggestion of something colder coming. "Mrs. Steinhardt, I am not your enemy. I am trying to help you. I know. Then let me help. You can help by believing that what I am building will work." Edna's face hardened. Not with anger. With grief. The particular grief of a woman who has already lost a child to winter and cannot bear to watch another woman make the same mistake. "And if it does not work," she said, "if that mud thing cracks in January, if the cold gets through, if your boy's cough gets worse, if you run out of fuel, what then? Then I will fix it. You cannot fix frozen children, Mrs. Steinhardt." The words landed like stones. Katrin felt each one. Edna took a step closer. Her voice dropped, and what came out was not a warning, but something closer to a prophecy, spoken with the authority of a woman who had earned the right to speak it. "If that thing fails in January," she said, "you will have killed your own children." She turned and walked back to the buckboard. She climbed up, gathered the reins, and sat for a moment without moving. "I will pray for you," she said. "But prayer does not heat a house." She drove away. The buckboard rattled down the track and grew smaller and smaller until it was just a dark speck on the endless brown ocean of grass. And then it was gone, and the prairie was silent again. And Katrin stood alone among her rows of bricks with Edna's words ringing in her ears like a bell that would not stop. "If that thing fails in January, you will have killed your own children." She would hear that sentence again. In October, when the first frost came. In November, when she lit the first fire. In December, when the temperature dropped. In January, when the blizzard came. She would hear it in the dark, in the cold, in the moments when doubt crept in through the cracks like winter air. Edna Dawson's voice, steady and sure and heavy with the weight of a dead daughter speaking the words that every mother fears most. "You will have killed your own children." Katrin picked up her shovel. She walked back to the creek. She dug. Colton Whitfield arrived on the last day of September. He came on horseback, which was unusual for a man who preferred the dignity of a buggy, and he brought with him a leather-bound notebook and the particular expression of a government official who has already made up his mind and is visiting only to confirm what he has decided. He dismounted, tied his horse to the wagon wheel, and walked a slow circle around the property. He examined the tar paper walls. He examined the sod roof. He examined the cracked iron stove that Katrin had not used since August because she knew it was beyond saving. He wrote in his notebook with small, precise handwriting that moved across the page like ants. He stopped in front of the rows of bricks. "What are these?" "Bricks," Katrin said, "for a stove. A stove. A masonry stove, clay and straw. It holds heat." Whitfield wrote something in his notebook. He did not ask how it worked. He did not ask where she had learned to build it. He did not ask any question that suggested genuine curiosity. He was not curious. He was assessing. "Mrs. Steinhardt," he said, snapping the notebook closed. "The Homestead Act requires that you make adequate improvements to your claim within the proving up period. Adequate improvements include a habitable dwelling, which means a structure capable of sustaining human life through all seasons, including winter." He gestured at the cabin with his pen. "What I see here is a tar paper shack with no functional heating apparatus walls that would not stop a determined wind and a pile of mud bricks that you apparently intend to use as a substitute for a proper stove." "It is not a substitute," Katrin said. "It is better." Whitfield looked at her with the tired patience of a man who has heard too many claims from too many homesteaders who did not make it. "Mrs. Steinhardt, I am noting in my report that the improvements on this claim are, at this time, inadequate. If conditions have not materially changed by spring inspection, your claim will be subject to review and possible revocation." He tucked the notebook into his coat. "I strongly recommend that you consider alternative arrangements for the winter. Freeman has a boarding house. The county has relocation funds. There is no shame in recognizing when a situation is not tenable." He mounted his horse. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that was courteous in form and dismissive in substance. Then he rode away, taking with him the last of the warm September sunlight, leaving Katrin standing among her bricks, with one more voice added to the chorus of people telling her that what she was doing could not be done. She did not watch him go. She was already counting bricks, already calculating how many more she needed. Already doing the math that mattered, the math that had nothing to do with dollars and everything to do with clay and fire, and the memory of a woman who had been dead for 16 years, but whose voice still echoed in her hands every time she shaped a brick. October came, and with it the first frost. Katrin felt it before she saw it, a sharpening of the air in the pre-dawn darkness, a bite at the edges of her breath that had not been there the day before. She stepped outside, and the grass crunched under her boots, each blade coated in a thin skin of ice that glittered in the early light, like something precious, like something the earth had offered up as both a gift and a warning. The stove was taking shape. She had begun laying courses in the second week of September, working from the center of the cabin outward, building the firebox first, then the channels, then the walls. The structure rose slowly, each course a careful arrangement of bricks mortared with wet clay, each channel measured by handspan, the way Oma Brigitte had taught her. 3 spans wide, 2 spans tall, with turns that curved gently instead of cutting sharp, because the smoke must be invited, never forced. It was enormous. In the small cabin, it dominated the space the way a heart dominates a chest, not by choice, but by necessity. The children had learned to navigate around it, pressing against the walls, to pass ducking under the mantle, treating the growing mass of clay and brick as a new member of the family, one that took up more room than the rest of them combined, but that if it worked would earn its space 1,000 times over. Liesel helped with the upper courses, standing on a crate to reach her, small hands placing bricks with a precision that surprised Katrin. The girl had inherited something, not just the knowledge, but the feel for it, the instinct for where a brick should go, how much mortar to use, how to tap it level with the heel of her palm. She did not talk while she worked. She listened. She watched her mother's hands and did what they did the way daughters had been learning from mothers since before anyone thought to write such lessons down. Fritz watched from his corner, coughing. And then on the 23rd of October, the rain came. It started in the late afternoon, a dark line of cloud that rolled in from the northwest with a speed that caught Katrine off guard. She had not been watching the sky. She had been inside fitting the last bricks of the smoke shelf, the critical component where the channels merged before entering the chimney, the piece that determined whether the smoke would rise or pool, the piece that she had gotten wrong when she was 16. The rain hit hard, not the gentle, soaking rain of spring, but the driving, hammering rain of a prairie storm, rain that came sideways and turned the ground to mud in minutes and ran in sheets across the flat land with nothing to stop it. The bricks. Katrin ran outside. The rows of unfired bricks, nearly 100 of them. The reserves she had been saving for repairs and final finishing sat in the open south of the cabin, where they had been drying for weeks. The rain was already on them. She could see them darkening, softening, the hard edges beginning to slump as the water penetrated the clay. She grabbed the tarpaulin from the wagon bed and tried to cover them, but the wind tore it from her hands. She tried again. The tarpaulin wrapped around her legs, and she fell face first into the mud. And when she pushed herself up, she could see the bricks dissolving, brick after brick, row after row, weeks of work melting back into the earth they had come from. She saved some, maybe 2/3. She dragged them under the wagon, under the narrow overhang of the cabin roof, anywhere she could find shelter. But 1/3 of them were gone, reduced to lumps of wet clay that sat in puddles of red-brown water like something that had given up. When the rain stopped, Katrine stood in the dark and looked at what was left. Her dress was soaked. Her hands were numb. Her shoulders ached with a deep structural pain that went beyond muscle and into bone. And somewhere inside her, in the place where Edna Dawson's words lived, a voice said the thing she had been refusing to hear. You cannot do this. You are not enough. You are not her. You are not Oma Brigida. You are the girl who got the channels wrong. The girl who filled a house with smoke. The girl whose hands were never quite sure enough. Never quite steady enough. Never quite good enough to do this alone. She stood there. The stars came out one by one, cold and distant and perfectly indifferent to the woman standing alone in the mud below them. The prairie stretched away in every direction, dark and flat and endless. And for the first time since she had arrived in Dakota Territory, Katrine Steinhardt felt truly, completely, irreversibly alone. Then she heard the footsteps. Liesl came around the corner of the cabin barefoot, her nightgown muddy at the hem. She had been watching from the window. She had seen her mother fall. She had seen the bricks dissolve. She had seen all of it. She walked to where Katrine stood and took her mother's hand. She did not speak. She did not offer comfort or encouragement, or any of the words that people say when they want to help, but do not know how. She simply stood there, a girl of 11 holding her mother's hand in the dark, her small fingers wrapped around Katrine's mud-caked palm, her grip firm and warm and unshakable. And they stood like that for a long time. The wind dried the puddles. The stars turned overhead. Somewhere out on the prairie, a coyote called and another answered, and the two voices wove together and faded into the silence that always followed. Katrin looked down at her daughter. Liesl looked up at her mother, and something passed between them that did not need language, not German, not English, not any tongue that human beings had ever devised. It was older than language. It was the thing that mothers and daughters have been passing back and forth since the first woman shaped the first clay beside the first fire and showed her daughter how to do the same. Katrin squeezed Liesel's hand. "Tomorrow," she said in German, "we start again." Liesel nodded. They went inside. The half-built stove stood in the center of the cabin, massive and white and waiting. The firebox was ready. The channels were laid. The smoke shelf was in place. What remained was the outer wall, the finishing courses, the chimney connection, and 100 replacement bricks that did not yet exist. 6 weeks until the deep cold. 6 weeks to dig more clay shape, more bricks, dry them, lay them, finish the stove that Oma Brigitte had designed, and Katrine had failed to build once, and was now building again alone with nothing but memory, and 2 hands and a daughter who stood in the rain, because she believed her mother could do what no one else believed was possible. Katrine lay down on the dirt floor beside her children. Fritz coughed in his sleep, a sound that was becoming as familiar as breathing. Annie murmured something and rolled over. Liesel was already asleep, one hand still reaching toward her mother. Katrine closed her eyes. She could feel the half-built stove radiating the last heat of the day, the clay still warm from the afternoon sun, holding it, remembering it, giving it back slowly into the dark room. 20 minutes of fire, 20 hours of heat. She would finish it. She would finish it because Oma Brigitte had taught her how, and because Liesel was watching, and because somewhere in the clay itself there was a memory older than her grandmother, and older than her grandmother's grandmother. A memory of how to keep the cold away. A memory that had crossed an ocean and a continent, and was now waiting patient and heavy and warm in the walls of an unfinished stove in a tar paper cabin on the edge of the world. She slept, and in her sleep she dreamed of warm walls. November arrived the way a creditor arrives quietly at first, then with increasing insistence, then with a knock that could not be ignored. The first snow came on the 3rd of the month. Not a blizzard, not even a proper storm, just a thin dusting that appeared overnight and lay across the prairie like a sheet pulled over a body, white and flat and still. By noon it had melted. By evening the ground was dry again. But the message had been delivered. Winter was no longer a theory. It was a schedule, and the schedule was accelerating. Katrine had spent every waking hour of the past 3 weeks replacing what the rain had taken. She dug clay in the cold. She mixed it with numb fingers. She shaped bricks in the gray light of October mornings and laid them in rows that she covered with canvas at night, because she would not be caught by the weather again. She would not give the sky another chance to undo her work. The stove grew. Course by course, brick by brick, it rose toward the ceiling of the small cabin like something being born. The outer walls thickened. The channels inside wound back and forth in their careful zigzag pattern, each turn measured by handspan, each angle checked by eye, each surface smoothed with wet fingers until it was as close to right as human hands could make it. By the 2nd week of November, it was finished. Katrine stood back and looked at it. The structure filled the center of the cabin, the way a boulder fills a stream, massive and permanent and impossible to ignore. The outer surface had been whitewashed with a mixture of lime and water that she had bought in Freeman for 60 cents, the last luxury she would allow herself until spring. The whitewash gave the stove a clean, almost luminous appearance, as though it were generating its own light. a great white monolith standing in the middle of a tar paper shack, like something that belonged to a different century, a different continent, a different story altogether. The firebox at the base was lined with the hardest bricks. She had the ones she had fired separately in a pit behind the cabin, baking them for 2 days in a slow fire of twisted grass until they turned dark and dense and rang when struck. The loading door was a piece of flat iron salvaged from the broken stove, fitted into the clay frame and sealed with a mortar of ash and clay that could be chipped out and replaced when it cracked. Inside, invisible from the outside, the channels waited, 6 of them winding through the body of the stove in a descending zigzag, each one carrying the smoke and heat from the firebox through a longer and longer path before finally releasing it to the chimney. Each channel extracted heat from the smoke and transferred it to the surrounding clay. By the time the smoke reached the chimney, it would be cool, almost cold, carrying with it only a fraction of the energy that the fire had produced. The rest would be trapped in the clay, held there, stored there, released slowly into the room over the course of 20 hours. That was the theory. Katrine had built the channels from memory. She had measured them with her hands. She had smoothed the turns and checked the angles and done everything exactly the way she remembered Oma Brigitte doing it, every step, every proportion, every detail. But memory is not certainty. Memory is a reconstruction, a story the mind tells itself about something that happened long ago. And like all stories, it can be wrong. It can leave out a crucial detail. It can rearrange the sequence. It can remember the shape but forget the size. Remember the angle but forget the curve. Remember the lesson but forget the correction. Katrin knew this. She had known it since the day she stood in a yard in Ukraine and watched smoke pour from a doorway because she had gotten one angle wrong. The stove was finished. The question was whether it was finished correctly. There was only one way to find out. She chose a cold morning to light the first fire. November 14th. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees overnight. Cold enough to make the test meaningful. Cold enough to feel the difference if the stove worked. Cold enough to feel the consequences if it did not. The children watched from the far side of the cabin, pressed against the wall, their breath visible in the cold air. Liesel stood with her arms around Fritz and Annie, holding them close, her eyes fixed on her mother with an expression that was equal parts faith and fear. Katrin knelt before the firebox. She had prepared the fuel the night before, a bundle of dried prairie grass twisted into tight knots, each one the size of a fist, packed tight enough to burn hot and fast. She arranged them inside the firebox, building a small pyramid the way Oma Brigitte had shown her. She struck the match. The grass caught immediately. The flame was bright and eager, racing through the twisted bundles with a sound like whispered excitement, crackling and popping and sending sparks up into the dark throat of the firebox. Within seconds, the fire was roaring a contained and furious heat that turned the air above it into something visible, shimmering and alive. Katrine watched the smoke. This was the moment. This was where the channels either worked or did not. The smoke should rise from the firebox into the first channel, travel its length, turn, descend into the second channel, turn again, rise into the third, and so on 6 times each pass, extracting heat until finally reaching the chimney and exiting clean and cool. The smoke rose. She could see it entering the first channel, a gray ribbon disappearing into the clay. She pressed her ear against the wall and listened. She could hear it moving, a soft rushing sound like wind in a distant hallway. Then the sound changed. It thickened, slowed, became something heavier, something that was not moving the way it should. And then, before she could react, smoke began seeping through the joints of the third channel gray wisps. At first, then thicker plumes, and then a heavy, choking cloud that poured into the cabin like something that had been caged and suddenly freed. Fritz began coughing. Not his usual cough. A violent, gasping cough that bent him double and turned his face red and then purple. Liesl pulled him toward the door. Annie started crying. The cabin filled with smoke so thick that Katrine could not see the far wall, could not see her children, could not see anything except the white surface of the stove disappearing into gray. She threw open the door. The cold air rushed in and the smoke rushed out. And for a moment the cabin was a war between two atmospheres. The heat and smoke pushing outward, the cold pulling inward, and caught in the middle were four people and a stove that was not working. Katrin pulled the burning grass from the firebox with the iron tongs, carried it outside, and dropped it in the snow where it hissed and died. She went back inside. The smoke was clearing, drawn out by the draft from the open door, and in the gray haze she could see the stove standing exactly where she had built it. Exactly as she had built it, white and massive and wrong. Liesl looked at her from the doorway, Fritz pressed against her side, still coughing. And in her daughter's eyes, Katrine saw the thing she had been dreading since August. Not anger, not blame. Worse, fear. The specific fear of a child who has bet everything on her mother's ability and is watching that bet fail. Katrin closed her eyes. The third channel. The smoke had backed up in the third channel. The same channel. The same failure. The same mistake she had made 16 years ago in a village on the Ukrainian steppe when she was young and proud, and sure that she had learned enough to do it alone. She had not learned enough then. She had repeated the error now, and for a terrible, crystalline moment, standing in the smoke-haze cabin with Fritz coughing and Annie crying and Liesl staring at her with those two old eyes, Katrin felt the full weight of Edna Dawson's prophecy settle on her shoulders. You will have killed your own children. She opened her eyes. No, not yet. Not while her hands still worked. Not while her memory still held the correction. Because she remembered now not just the failure, but the fix. Not just the mistake, but the moment Oma Brigitte had knelt beside the stove and found the problem and solved it with the calm, unhurried precision of a woman who understood that mistakes were not endings, but instructions. The third channel. The turn was too sharp. The smoke could not make the bend. It pulled and backed up and fought the only way smoke knows how to fight, by refusing to go where you want it to go. The fix was simple. The turn had to be wider, smoother. A curve instead of a corner. The smoke had to be invited, not forced. Katrin pulled on her work gloves. She looked at Liesl. Take your brother and sister outside, she said. Keep Fritz warm. I need 2 hours. Liesl hesitated. Go, Katrin said. I know what is wrong. I know how to fix it. Something in her voice must have carried more than words, because Liesl nodded and took her siblings out. Wrapping Fritz in the heaviest blanket, and settling them against the south wall of the cabin out of the wind where the thin November sun provided at least the idea of warmth. Katrin went to work. She dismantled the third channel brick by brick carefully, methodically stacking the bricks in order, so she would know exactly where each one went when she rebuilt. The mortar was still green, still soft enough to chip out without breaking the bricks themselves. She exposed the turn the sharp 90-degree angle where the channel changed direction, and she could see the problem as clearly as if Oma Brigitte were standing beside her, pointing at it with a clay-covered finger. Too sharp. The smoke hits this wall and has nowhere to go but backward. She rebuilt the turn. Wider. Gentler. Instead of a hard corner, she shaped a curve using smaller pieces of brick to create an arc that guided the channel around the bend, like a road curving through a hillside, smooth and natural, and forgiving. She mortared each piece in place and smoothed the interior surface with wet fingers until there were no ridges, no lips, no obstructions. Nothing for the smoke to catch on. Nothing to slow it down. It took 3 hours, not 2. When she was finished, the light outside had shifted from the thin white of morning to the pale gold of early afternoon. Her hands were raw. Her back ached. The mortar needed time to set. She waited until the next morning, November 15th. 12 degrees above zero. A morning so cold that the frost on the inside of the window had frozen into patterns that looked like ferns, delicate and intricate and beautiful in the way that deadly things are sometimes beautiful. Katrin knelt before the firebox again. Same fuel, same arrangement, same match. The children were outside this time. She had insisted. If it failed again, they did not need to breathe the smoke. If it failed again, she was not sure she could bear to see Liesel's face. She struck the match. The fire caught. The flame rose. The smoke entered the first channel with its familiar rushing sound. Katrin pressed her ear against the wall and followed it with her hearing the way a doctor follows a heartbeat with a stethoscope. First channel. Good. Turn. Second channel. Good. Turn. Third channel. She held her breath. The rushing sound continued. Smooth. Steady. Uninterrupted. The smoke moved through the rebuilt turn without hesitation, without backing up, without fighting. She followed it to the fourth channel, the fifth, the sixth. And then outside, rising from the tin chimney pipe, a thin wisp of gray-white smoke appeared against the cold blue sky, clean and light, and almost transparent. Katrin let out the breath she had been holding. She stayed inside for 20 minutes while the fire burned. She fed it twice more, adding bundles of twisted grass, building the heat, pushing the temperature inside the firebox as high as it would go. The fire roared. The clay absorbed. And then the fuel was spent, and the fire died and the firebox went dark. She pressed her hand against the outer wall of the stove. Warm, not hot, not burning. Warm the way a living body is warm. The way sunlight is warm on a stone in the afternoon. A deep, even penetrating warmth that seemed to come from somewhere far inside the clay. From a place where the fire had left its memory. She pressed both hands against it. She pressed her cheek against it. She closed her eyes and felt the heat radiating into her skin, into her bones, into the cold places inside her. that had been cold for so long that she had forgotten what warmth felt like. She opened the door. "Come inside," she called. The children came in cautious at first, then faster, as the warmth hit them. Annie ran to the stove and pressed herself against it like a cat finding a sunbeam. Fritz touched the surface with his fingertips, and then his palms, and then leaned his whole body against it. And for the first time in weeks, his face relaxed, the tension draining out of it like water from a cracked cup. The cough still there, but somehow quieter, somehow less insistent, as though even his lungs recognized that something had changed. Liesl stood in the doorway. She looked at the stove. She looked at her mother. And then she did something that she had not done since her father died. She smiled. Not a large smile, not the kind that transforms a face. A small smile, quiet and private, the kind that lives in the corners of the mouth and says more than laughter ever could. Katrin smiled back, and in that exchange, in that small moment between a mother and a daughter standing in a cabin that should not have been warm, but something was completed. A circle that had begun in Ukraine 16 years ago, in a yard where a girl had failed, and a grandmother had fixed the failure and said, "Remember this well." The circle closed. The lesson landed. The stove worked. The temperature outside dropped to 10 below zero that night. Inside the stove held at 52 degrees. The children slept without shivering for the first time since they had left Nebraska. December came with teeth. The cold deepened in stages, each one worse than the last, each one testing the stove in a way that the previous one had not. 10 below, 15 below, 20 below. The kind of cold that froze the water in the bucket beside the bed, that turned breath into needles, that carried sound across miles of empty prairie so that you could hear a dog barking in Freeman from 12 miles away, the sound traveling through air so dense and still. It was almost solid. Inside the cabin, the stove performed. Katrin had developed a rhythm. She lit the fire at dawn, a fast, hot blaze of twisted grass and dried sunflower stalks, and whatever else would burn quickly and at high temperature. 20 minutes, sometimes 25. The firebox roared. The channels drew. The smoke traveled its long zigzag path through the body of the stove and exited clean through the chimney. And then the fire died, and the clay took over. For the next 20 hours, the stove radiated. The thick walls released their stored heat slowly, steadily, without fluctuation, without the peaks and valleys of an iron stove that burned hot when fed and went cold when the fuel ran out. The temperature inside the cabin held between 48 and 55 degrees. Depending on the weather outside, a range that was not luxurious but was survivable, livable, even comfortable if you wore a sweater and kept moving. The children adapted. Fritz slept nearest the stove where the floor was warmest. His cough still present, but no longer worsening, held in check by the constant gentle heat that surrounded him like a hand cupped around a small flame. Annie slept on the other side, curled against the warm clay like a question mark. Her yellow hair spread across the packed earth, her breathing slow and deep and untroubled. Liesl slept between them, one arm reaching toward each, a bridge between her siblings, a guardian even in sleep. Katrin slept last and woke first. This was not sacrifice. This was simply what mothers did. Silas Dawson came on the 14th of December. He had not visited since August, since the day he had ridden away with his warning and his arithmetic and his grim certainty that this woman and her children would not survive. 4 months. Long enough for a man to wonder. Long enough for curiosity to outweigh stubbornness. Long enough for the rumors from Freeman to reach his ears, rumors about smoke rising from a cabin that should have been dark by now. Rumors about a widow and her clay stove, and the particular impossibility of what she appeared to be doing. He rode up in the late morning, dismounted, and stood outside the cabin for a long moment before knocking. He could feel it. The warmth. It was coming through the walls, through the tar paper, and the rough lumber radiating outward into the cold December air in a way that iron stoves simply did not do. Katrin opened the door. She did not seem surprised to see him. She stepped aside and let him in. He stood in the center of the small room and looked at the stove. It was the most substantial thing he had ever seen in a homesteader's cabin, and he had been inside dozens of them over the years. The whitewashed surface gleamed in the dim light, smooth and clean and impossibly warm. He took off his glove and placed his bare hand flat against it. The heat was immediate. Not surface heat, not the sharp, fleeting warmth of an iron stove that burned your fingers and left you cold 10 minutes later. This was deeper, slower. A warmth that came from inside the clay itself, from somewhere within the mass of earth and straw and memory. A warmth that felt less like fire and more like the sun, steady and ancient and patient. "I'll be damned," Silas said. He kept his hand there. He moved it to another spot. Same warmth. He walked around the stove, touching it at different heights, different angles. Same warmth everywhere. Even consistent, radiating from every surface like heat from a living body. "When did you last light the fire?" he asked. "This morning, before sunrise." He looked at his watch. Nearly noon. 6 hours since the fire, and the stove was still warm enough to heat the cabin. No iron stove in Dakota could do that. No iron stove anywhere could do that. How long does it hold but 20 hours? Sometimes more. Silas pulled his hand away slowly, as though reluctant to break contact with something he did not understand, but recognized as significant. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me nothing. I told you that you could not winter here. I told you that your children would be the youngest to die. You told me what you believed. I believed wrong." Katrin did not answer. She was not interested in apologies. She was interested in survival, and survival was not yet assured. It was December. The real tests were still ahead. Silas seemed to understand this because his expression shifted. The wonder faded. Something harder took its place, something that looked like concern. "It works," he said. "I can see that it works. But, Mrs. Steinhardt, you have not yet seen a real Dakota blizzard. December cold is one thing. January cold is another. When the wind comes, when the snow blows sideways, and the temperature drops to 30, 40 below. When the whiteout lasts for days, and you cannot open your door, that is when the stoves fail. That is when the iron cracks and the fires die, and the people who thought they were ready discover that they were not." He pulled his glove back on. "I am not saying this to frighten you. I am saying it because January is different. January is when Dakota decides who stays." He left. His horse's hooves crunched on the frozen ground, growing fainter. And then there was only the wind and the creak of the tar paper walls, and the deep, quiet warmth of the stove, doing what it had been built to do. Katrine stood alone in the cabin and listened to the heat. The news about the Ericksons arrived 3 days later, carried by a rider from Freeman, who stopped at every homestead along the way, delivering the information with the flat, practiced tone of someone who has learned to speak about death without letting it touch him. The Ericksons, Nils and Margit, 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 3, Norwegian immigrants who had homesteaded 4 miles north of Katrine's claim. They had been found by a neighbor who noticed that their chimney had stopped smoking on the morning of December 15th. The neighbor waited a day, thinking perhaps they had gone to town. When the chimney still showed nothing on the 16th, he rode over. He found them in the main room of their soddy, all 4 of them arranged around an iron stove that had gone cold. They had plenty of wood. 8 cords stacked and covered more than enough for the winter by any reasonable calculation. But the wood was stacked outside 20 feet from the door. And when the temperature dropped to 28 below on the night of the 14th, Nils had gone out to get another load and had become disoriented in the dark. He was found the next morning 30 feet from the woodpile, facing the wrong direction, frozen in mid-stride. Margit and the children had stayed inside. Without Nils, without more wood, the fire in the iron stove burned through what remained in the firebox. Within a few hours, the iron cooled. The cold came in. By morning, the temperature inside the soddy was the same as the temperature outside. Katrine received this news in silence. She had known the Ericksons, not well. They had spoken perhaps 3 times. But Margit Erickson was the only woman in the area who had shown Katrine kindness without conditions, without warnings, without the particular brand of concern that was really just doubt wearing a sympathetic face. On Katrine's 2nd day in Dakota, Margit had ridden over with a basket containing bread salt, a small jar of blackberry preserves, and a note written in Norwegian that neither of them could read in the other's language. They had stood in the yard and smiled at each other and pointed at things and laughed at the absurdity of 2 women from 2 countries trying to communicate with gestures and goodwill. And it had been the only moment of genuine warmth that Katrine had felt since Johann's death. Now Margit was gone. Her children were gone. Her husband was gone. A family that had done everything right, that had 8 cords of wood and a sound iron stove and a solid sod house, dead because a man walked 20 feet in the wrong direction on a dark night. Katrine sat beside her stove that evening and pressed her hand against the warm clay and felt something that she had not expected to feel. Not grief, though grief was there. Not fear, though fear was there too. What she felt was doubt, real doubt. The kind that does not argue but simply asks a question and then waits for an answer that does not come. If the Ericksons could die with 8 cords of wood and a good stove, what made her think she could survive with no wood at all and a stove made of mud? If a man could freeze to death 20 feet from his own door, what chance did a woman alone with 3 children have when the real cold came? If January was truly different from December, if the blizzards were truly worse than anything she had experienced, if Dakota cold was truly a different animal from the cold she had known on the steppe, then what was she doing here? What was she building? What was she betting her children's lives on? A memory. That was all. A memory of a grandmother's stove in a country she would never see again, built by a woman she would never speak to again. In a winter that was not this winter, on a steppe that was not this prairie, against a cold that was not this cold. She sat in the dark. The stove radiated. The children slept. Outside, the temperature was 22 below zero and falling. "Oma," she whispered, her hand flat against the warm clay, her voice so quiet that even the children would not have heard it if they had been awake. "Did I build it right this time?" No answer came. No answer ever came. But the wall was warm under her palm, and the floor was warm under her body, and her children were breathing steadily in the gentle heat. And sometimes the absence of an answer is an answer in itself. Christmas came quietly. Katrin had saved a small portion of flour and a piece of salt pork that she had been rationing since October. She made biscuits. Real biscuits, not the flat, heavy cakes of cornmeal and water that had been their daily bread for weeks, but actual biscuits with a crust that cracked when you broke them, and an inside that was soft and warm and tasted if you closed your eyes and wanted it badly enough, almost like the bread her mother used to make. She fried the salt pork in the one good pan and let the fat render into the flour for gravy. It was not a feast. It was barely a meal. But the children ate it as though it were a banquet, sitting cross-legged on the warm floor around the stove, their plates balanced on their knees, their faces lit by the oil lamp that Katrine had been saving for a special occasion. Liesel gave Katrine a drawing. She had made it on the back of a flour sack with a piece of charcoal, and it showed the stove rendered with the careful precision of a child who pays attention to things. The channels were visible through the walls, drawn as dotted lines winding back and forth. The firebox was a small rectangle at the base, with tiny flames inside it. And on top of the stove, standing with one hand resting on the surface, was a figure that was clearly Katrine, though taller and straighter than Katrine felt these days. "It is beautiful," Katrine said in German. She folded it carefully and placed it inside the Bible between the pages of Psalms where it would stay for 30 years. Fritz told a story about the horse his father had promised to buy him. A bay horse, he said, like Mr. Dawson's, with a white blaze and fast legs. Papa had said they would buy it when they got to Dakota. Papa had said a lot of things. Fritz told the story without sadness, without longing, with the straightforward factuality of a child who has not yet learned that some promises die with the people who make them. Then Annie asked her question. "Is Papa warm where he is?" The cabin went still. Even the stove seemed to hold its breath, the crackle of cooling clay falling silent for a moment, as though the question had reached into the walls and touched something. Katrin pulled Annie into her lap. The child was small and warm and smelled like biscuits and earth. "Yes," she said. "Papa is warm." "How do you know?" Katrin pressed her cheek against the top of Annie's head and closed her eyes. "How do you know?" The question a 5-year-old asks that a theologian cannot answer. The question that has no response except faith. And faith is a stove you cannot see built from materials you cannot touch in a place you have never been. "Because Oma Brigitte is there," Katrin said. "And Oma Brigitte always knew how to keep everyone warm." Annie considered this. She seemed to find it satisfactory. She leaned against her mother and closed her eyes, and within minutes she was asleep. And the Christmas that would be the only Christmas of Katrine's life that she would remember clearly was over. The first week of January brought cold that felt personal. 20 below, 25 below. Numbers that stopped being numbers and became physical forces, pressures that pushed against the cabin walls, that squeezed through every gap and crack and seam, that turned the air outside into something that was not quite air. Something thicker and meaner and more deliberate. The cold did not just arrive. It settled. It occupied. It moved into the prairie the way an army moves into a conquered territory, slowly and completely leaving nothing unclaimed. The stove held. Katrine lit it at dawn. She lit it again at dusk. 2 fires a day, 20 minutes each, burning fast and hot, and then dying, leaving behind a warmth that lasted until the next fire, and the next day, and the next night. The temperature inside the cabin did not waver. 51 degrees, 52, 49 on the coldest nights when the wind found the gaps in the tar paper and pushed through them like fingers, but never below 48, never into the range where breath becomes visible and skin begins to lose its fight. Fritz's cough persisted. Some days it was better a dry, shallow sound that came and went without urgency. Other days it deepened into something that worried Katrine, a wet, rattling cough that seemed to come from a place too deep inside a boy of 8. But the warmth was helping. She could see it. The cough did not worsen the way coughs worsened in cold houses, the way Clara Dawson's cough had worsened in the winter of '81. The warmth held it in check, kept it at a level that was uncomfortable but not dangerous, persistent but not progressing. On the 9th of January, Silas came again. This time he did not come alone. Edna was with him, sitting beside him in the buckboard, wrapped in a heavy coat that made her look twice her size. She did not get down. She sat in the wagon and looked at the cabin and said nothing while Silas went inside. He was direct. "Mrs. Steinhardt, I need to talk to you about something." Katrine offered him coffee. She did not have real coffee. She had a chicory substitute that tasted like burnt earth, but it was hot. And on the prairie in January, hot was the only quality that mattered. "There has been talk in Freeman," Silas said, "about the cold, about what is coming. The old men, the ones who have been here 20, 30 years, they say this winter feels different. They say the patterns are wrong. The warm spells come too fast, and the cold comes too hard, and the sky has a look to it that they do not like." He paused. He wrapped his hands around the cup and looked into it, as though the chicory might tell him how to say what he had come to say. "I want you to consider moving to our place, just for the worst of it. January, maybe February. Our house is bigger. We have room, and we have 12 cords of wood stacked and covered. Mr. Dawson, please, let me finish." He took a breath. "I know you have your reasons for staying. I know you are worried about Whitfield and the claim, but a claim is just land. Your children are your children. If it comes to the worst, land can be filed again. Children cannot." Katrine looked at him. She saw the sincerity in his face, the genuine concern, the particular anguish of a man who had already lost a child to winter and could not stand the thought of watching it happen again, even to someone else's child. She also saw something he probably did not see in himself, the assumption. The assumption that his way was the right way, that iron and wood were superior to clay and memory, that the fact of his 12 cords made his house safer than hers. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "your stove is iron." "It is. If you run out of wood, your stove goes cold." "We will not run out." The Ericksons did not think they would run out either. The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Silas's face changed. The Ericksons. He had known them. He had traded with Niels. He had held Niels' daughter, once a laughing child with her mother's eyes. And now she was dead, and the memory of holding her was one more weight in a life that was already carrying too many. "That was different," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "If I leave," Katrine said, "Whitfield takes my claim. He told me so. Inadequate improvements, abandoned property, another name on another list. And in the spring, when the snow melts everything, I built the stove, the bricks, the channels, all of it becomes someone else's, or no one's. And my children and I start again, with nothing. But you would be alive. I am alive now. My stove works. It has worked for 2 months. It will work in January. You do not know that." "I know clay," she said. "I know fire. I know how heat moves through earth. I've known these things since I was 16 years old. And the woman who taught me knew them since she was a girl. And the woman who taught her knew them before that. This stove has been keeping people alive for longer than this country has existed." Silas set down his cup. He looked at the stove. He looked at Katrine. "Pride will freeze you, Mrs. Steinhardt." She shook her head. "It is not pride," she said. "It is arithmetic. My stove uses 40 pounds of grass a day. Your stove uses a cord of wood a week. My fuel is free and everywhere. Your fuel is expensive and buried under snow. If the blizzard lasts 3 days, which stove runs out first?" Silas opened his mouth. He closed it. He had no answer because the answer was obvious. And the obvious answer was not the one he wanted to give. He stood. He pulled on his gloves. "I am 6 miles south," he said. "If you change your mind, the door is open, day or night. Thank you, Mr. Dawson." "Silas?" "Thank you, Silas." He nodded. He walked to the door, stopped, and turned back. "Your grandmother," he said. "The one who taught you. She must have been something." Katrin smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that lives in the corners of the mouth, the kind that carries more weight than laughter. She was. He left. Through the open door, Katrine could see Edna waiting in the buckboard, her face unreadable behind the scarf, her eyes fixed on the cabin. Their gazes met for a moment. Then Edna looked away, and Silas climbed up beside her, and the buckboard pulled away, and the sound of hooves and wheels faded into the great white silence of the January prairie. Katrin closed the door. She pressed her back against it and stood there for a long moment, feeling the warmth of the stove against her face and the cold of the door against her spine, caught between 2 temperatures. 2 worlds, 2 kinds of certainty. She had made her choice. Now, January would make its. The morning of January the 12th, 1888 began as a gift. Katrine woke to warmth that was not entirely from the stove. Something was different. The light through the oiled paper window was brighter than it should have been, softer, carrying a quality that she had not seen in weeks. She pushed aside the blanket and went to the door. When she opened it, she gasped. The air was warm. Not warm by August standards, not warm by any reasonable measure, but warm for January in Dakota. 40 degrees, maybe higher, a temperature so unexpected and so welcome after weeks of sub-zero agony that it felt like a miracle, like the prairie had relented, like winter had taken a breath, and in that breath had allowed something close to mercy. The sky was clear. The sun was out. The snow in the yard was melting, dripping from the eaves of the cabin in small silver streams pooling in the ruts left by Silas's buckboard. The air smelled different. Not the sharp, metallic smell of deep cold, but something softer. Something that carried in it the distant memory of grass and earth and growing things. "Children," Katrine called. "Come outside." And they came, Fritz first blinking in the sunlight, his cough temporarily forgotten in the shock of warmth. Annie next squealing, running barefoot into the muddy yard before Katrin could stop her. Liesel last standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, looking at the sky with an expression that Katrin could not quite read. "What is it?" Katrin asked. Liesel shook her head. "I do not know. It does not feel right." "It is warm. It is warm," Liesel agreed. "That is what does not feel right." But the day was too beautiful to argue with. For the first time in weeks, the children played outside. Fritz threw snowballs at Annie, who threw them back with terrible aim and excellent enthusiasm. Liesel hung wet clothing on the line where it actually dried instead of freezing into rigid shapes. Katrin sat on the step and turned her face to the sun and let it warm her skin. And for a few minutes, just a few, she allowed herself to feel something that she had been rationing more carefully than flour: hope. Then, at 11 o'clock in the morning, she looked up. The western horizon had changed. It was subtle at first, a darkening along the edge of the sky, a thickening of the air in the distance, as though someone had drawn a line across the world and begun erasing everything on the other side. Katrin stood. She shielded her eyes. The line was moving, not slowly, not at the pace of normal weather, the gradual gathering of clouds, the lazy approach of a storm front. This was moving fast, impossibly fast. A wall of white churning and boiling, stretching from the ground to the top of the sky, consuming the horizon as it came. She had never seen anything like it. "Liesel," she said. Her voice was calm. She did not allow it to be otherwise. "Liesel, Fritz, get inside, now." Liesel looked at the horizon and went pale. She grabbed Fritz by the arm and pulled him toward the door. Katrin turned and scanned the yard. Annie, the girl, was not in the yard. She had wandered the way she always wandered, following something that had caught her attention, a bird or a butterfly, or the simple beckoning of open space. Katrin could not see her. The world was still bright and warm and deceptively calm. But the wall was coming, and it was coming faster than anything she had ever seen. And her youngest child was somewhere out there, in the open. "Annie!" she called. The wind shifted. It happened in the time it took to draw a breath. One moment the air was soft and warm, blowing gently from the south. The next moment it was a blade coming hard from the northwest. carrying in it a cold so sudden and so savage that it felt like being struck. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds. The sky went from blue to gray to white, and the wall hit. It did not arrive gradually. It arrived all at once, a curtain of snow and wind and noise that slammed into the prairie like a door being kicked open. The snow did not fall. It flew, horizontally driven by wind that shrieked at a pitch. Katrine had never heard a sound that was not weather, but something wilder, something that belonged to a world where human beings had never been meant to live. In 3 seconds, she could not see the cabin. In 5 seconds, she could not see her own hands. Annie. Her voice was torn from her mouth and shredded by the wind, scattered in 1,000 directions, swallowed by the white. She could hear nothing, see nothing, feel nothing except the wind and the snow and the cold. The cold that had teeth, the cold that was eating through her clothes and into her skin and down into her bones. She turned back. The cabin was gone. The world was gone. There was only white. White in every direction. White above and white below. And white on every side. A white that was not the absence of color, but the presence of something malevolent. Something that wanted to disorient, to confuse, to consume. Katrine dropped to her knees. She crawled to the cabin door, found it by memory, and by the feel of the wooden step under her hands, and grabbed the rope she kept coiled on the nail beside the frame. She had put it there, in November, not because she expected this, because Oma Brigitte had told her once that a rope between the house and the barn could save your life. And though Katrine had no barn, the lesson had stayed. She tied one end to the door handle. She wrapped the other end around her waist. She knotted it twice. "Liesel," she shouted into the cabin. "Stay inside. Hold Fritz. Do not open this door." Then she stepped into the white. 5 steps into the white, and the world ceased to exist. There was no sky. There was no ground. There was no horizon, no direction, no distance. There was only the wind and the snow and the sound. A sound that was not a single note, but a chord. A full-throated, multi-layered howl that came from everywhere, at once from above and below and from inside her own skull. A sound that was less heard than inhabited, as though the storm were not something happening around her, but something she had stepped into. Something alive and vast and deeply fundamentally indifferent to the small knot of flesh and fear that was trying to move through it. Katrine could not see. She held her hand in front of her face and saw nothing. Not the outline of fingers, not the shape of a palm. Nothing. The snow was not falling. It was being thrown, hurled horizontally by a wind that moved at speeds she had no reference. For wind that pushed against her body like a wall being leaned against. Her wind that found every gap in her clothing and drove the cold through it like nails. The rope unspooled behind her. She could feel it pulling at her waist, feel the tension connecting her to the cabin, to the door, to the only fixed point in a world that had lost all its fixed points. She held to that feeling the way a drowning person holds to a plank, not with her hands, but with her mind telling herself that as long as the rope held, she was not lost. As long as the rope led somewhere, she could come back. Annie. Her voice traveled nowhere. The wind caught it and tore it into pieces and scattered the pieces across the prairie like confetti. She called again and again. Each time her voice was smaller, thinner, more ridiculous against the enormity of the storm. She walked 10 steps from the door, counting each one because counting was the only navigation she had left. The rope played out behind her. 15 steps. 20. She was moving in the direction she believed Annie had gone, toward the south side of the cabin, where the child liked to chase grasshoppers in the summer, toward the slight depression in the ground, where snowmelt gathered in the spring. But belief was not knowledge, and in the whiteout, the difference between the two was the difference between life and a death. 25 steps. 30. She stopped. The rope behind her was taut nearly at its full length. She had perhaps 10 more feet. If Annie was beyond that, if the child had wandered further than 35 feet from the cabin door, then the rope would not reach, and Katrine would face a choice that no mother should ever have to face, the choice between the child behind the door and the child beyond the rope. She called again. She screamed the name into the wind with everything she had, a sound that came from the bottom of her lungs and the center of her chest, and some deeper place that is not the body at all, but the thing that lives inside the body and refuses to accept what the body already knows. Annie. And then, faint and small and almost indistinguishable from the wind itself, she heard it. A cry, not a word, not a name, not a call for help. Just a cry. The sound a small animal makes when it is cold and frightened and alone, a sound that cuts through noise the way a knife cuts through cloth. Clean and direct and impossible to mistake for anything other than what it is. To the left. Close. 5 feet, maybe less. Katrin lunged. She fell forward with her arms outstretched and her fingers spread wide, and her body flat against the snow, reaching, grasping, sweeping the ground, the way a blind woman sweeps a table for something she has dropped. Her right hand found nothing. Her left hand found cloth. She grabbed it. She pulled. And Annie came to her out of the white, a small body curled into itself, shaking violently, her face buried in her knees, her hands tucked under her arms, her yellow hair plastered flat with snow and ice. She was wearing her indoor clothes, the thin cotton dress and the wool stockings that were meant for the warm floor beside the stove, not for the killing cold of a Dakota blizzard. Her skin was the color of candle wax. Katrin pulled the child against her chest and wrapped her coat around both of them. She could feel Annie shaking deep, convulsive shudders that seemed to come not from the muscles, but from the bones, from somewhere structural, as though the cold had gotten into the framework of the child and was trying to shake it apart. She turned back toward the cabin and realized she did not know which way the cabin was. The rope was behind her, but behind her had lost its meaning. She had lunged, she had turned, she had fallen. And in those few seconds of desperate motion, she had lost the direction she had been facing. The rope now led away from her in a line that could have been pointing at the cabin, or could have been looped around a fence post, or could have been wrapped around her own legs. In the whiteout, she could not tell. She could not see where it went. She could not see anything. The wind screamed. The snow drove against her. Annie was going limp in her arms, the shaking slowing, which was not a good sign, which was the opposite of a good sign. which was the sign that the body was beginning to surrender. Katrin felt the fear. She let herself feel it fully, completely, without resistance. She felt it the way you feel a wave pass through you, rising and cresting, and then continuing on, leaving behind. Not calm, but clarity. The particular clarity that comes when fear has done its worst, and you are still standing. She knelt. She put Annie down on the snow, keeping one hand on the child at all times. With the other hand, she found the rope at her waist and pulled it. Not hard, gently. She let the rope slide through her fingers and felt for tension. Felt for the direction of the pull. The straight line that connected her to the door. There. The pull came from the right. Not behind her, not ahead, but to the right. She had turned further than she thought, but could she trust it? Could she trust a rope she could not see leading to a cabin? She could not see through a storm that had erased every landmark, every reference point, every familiar thing in the world. Then, through the white noise of the wind, she heard another voice. Not Annie's, not Liesel's. A voice from further away, from further back, from a place that was not the prairie and not the present. The ground never lies, Katrine. The wind changes, the snow blinds, but the ground stays where it is. Trust your feet. Trust your knees. Trust the earth. Oma Brigida. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, not a mystical visitation. Just memory surfacing the way memory surfaces in moments of extremity when the mind reaches past panic and past reason into the deep storage, where the oldest lessons live. The lessons learned not through the head, but through the hands and the knees and the skin. Katrin lowered herself flat against the ground. She pressed her palms into the snow and felt what was beneath it. Packed earth. Frozen hard, but not smooth. She could feel the irregularities, the small ridges and depressions that her own feet had made over months of walking the same path between the cabin and the privy, between the cabin and the creek, between the cabin and the spot where she dried her bricks. Paths worn into the ground by repetition, invisible under the snow, but present, still present, readable by touch, if not by sight. She followed them. On her knees, one arm holding Annie against her chest, the other hand sweeping the ground ahead of her. She crawled. She felt the path. With her fingertips felt the subtle hardness of packed earth beneath an inch of fresh snow. Felt it curve and straighten and curve again. She followed the rope's tension with one hand and the ground's memory with the other, and between the two, she assembled a direction. Not a certain one, not a guaranteed one, but the best direction she had. 10 feet. 20. The wind tried to push her sideways. The snow tried to blind her. The cold tried to convince her that movement was futile, that stopping was easier, that the white was not an enemy, but a blanket, not a killer, but a cradle. She kept crawling, and then her outstretched hand struck wood, the cabin wall, rough lumber under tar paper. The grain of it as familiar to her as the grain of her own skin. She followed it to the left, found the corner, found the south wall, found the door. She pulled it open. She fell inside with Annie in her arms. Liesel was there, pulling them both in, slamming the door against the wind, pressing her weight against it, while the storm raged on the other side like something cheated. Katrin lay on the warm floor and breathed. The stove radiated. The clay hummed with stored heat. The cabin was 54 degrees, and the world outside had dropped below zero and was still falling. And the distance between those two numbers was the distance between living and dying. And Katrine was on the right side of it. She was on the right side. The first 6 hours were triage. Annie's hands were blue. Not the blue of cold skin, not the blue of poor circulation, but a deeper, more structural blue, the blue of tissue that has begun to freeze, where the blood has retreated from the extremities and left behind something that is no longer quite alive. Her fingertips were the worst. They were white at the tips and purple at the base, and when Katrin touched them gently, Annie did not react, which meant the nerves were gone at least temporarily, and the question was whether they would come back. Katrin stripped the wet clothing off her daughter. She wrapped her in every dry blanket in the cabin, which was 3 2-wool and 1 cotton, and placed her on the floor directly beside the stove, where the clay radiated its deepest warmth into the packed earth. She tucked the blankets tight and rubbed Annie's feet between her hands gently, steadily, not hard enough to damage the frozen tissue, but firmly enough to encourage the blood to return. Slowly, over the course of an hour, the color changed. The white receded. The purple softened. The blue became pink, then red, and when the red came, the pain came with it. And Annie began to cry, which was the best sound Katrine had ever heard, because crying meant feeling and feeling meant alive. "I know," Katrine whispered, holding the small foot in her rough hands. "I know it hurts, but the hurting is good. The hurting means it is working." Annie cried herself to sleep. Katrine pulled the blankets higher and pressed the back of her hand against her daughter's forehead. Warm. Not hot. Warm. Good enough. Then she turned to Fritz. He was sitting against the far wall, his knees drawn up to his chin, his arms wrapped around his legs. He was coughing. Not the shallow, dry cough that had been his companion for months. This was different. This was deeper, wetter, coming from a place in his chest that Katrine had been praying the cold would not reach. The sound of it filled the small cabin like water filling a cup, rising with each breath. Each spasm, each rattling exhale that seemed to pull something loose inside him and send it tumbling upward into his throat. He had been outside for less than 5 minutes when the storm hit. 5 minutes. Long enough to breathe the cold air deep into his lungs. Deep enough to reach the tissue that was already weakened by months of coughing. Already inflamed. Already waiting for one more insult to push it past the threshold between sickness and crisis. Katrin knelt beside him. She put her hand on his forehead. Hot. Not warm. Hot. The kind of hot that does not belong on a child's skin. The kind that signals something happening inside the body, that the body is not winning. "Fritz," she said, "look at me." He looked. His eyes were glassy, the pupils large and dark, the whites beginning to show the faint pink of fever. He tried to speak, and the cough caught him a deep, tearing spasm that bent him forward and left him gasping, a thin thread of saliva hanging from his lip. Katrin had seen pneumonia before. She had seen it in the village on the steppe. She had seen it take old men in 3 days, and strong women in 5, and children in less time than it took to understand what was happening. She knew the signs: the wet cough, the fever, the labored breathing, the rapid pulse that she could feel under the thin skin of his wrist, beating too fast, working too hard. She knew what happened to children with pneumonia in houses that went cold. They died. The iron stoves ran out of fuel or cracked or simply could not keep up with the cold, and the temperature inside dropped, and the child's body, already fighting the infection, had to fight the cold as well. And eventually it could not fight both, and the fever won or the cold won, and either way the child lost. But this was not an iron stove. Katrin moved Fritz to the warmest spot in the cabin, the floor directly beside the stove, where the clay had been radiating heat into the earth for 2 months. And the ground itself was warm to the touch, warm enough to sit on, warm enough to sleep on, warm enough to hold a sick child, while his body fought the thing that was trying to kill him. She laid him on his side because lying on his side made the breathing easier. She placed a rolled blanket under his head and another behind his back. She pressed his body against the warm clay of the stove and tucked the remaining blanket around him, creating a cocoon of heat, a small pocket of warmth within the larger warmth of the cabin, concentrating the stove's heat around him like armor. "Rest," she said. "The heat will help you fight." He closed his eyes. The coughing continued, but between the spasms there were moments of quiet moments when his breathing steadied and his body relaxed against the warm clay. And in those moments, Katrine could almost believe that the worst would not come. Almost. Night fell. The storm did not. The wind increased after dark, which should not have been possible, which defied the usual pattern of prairie weather where storms peaked in the afternoon and diminished overnight. But this was not a usual storm. This was something else entirely. Something that the old settlers would later call the worst blizzard in the history of the American frontier. Something that would earn its own name, the Children's Blizzard, because of how many children it killed. The temperature outside dropped to 20 below, then 25, then 30. The wind-driven snow struck the walls of the cabin with a sound like gravel being thrown, a continuous rattling assault that went on and on and on without pause, without rhythm, without mercy. Inside the stove held, Katrin lit the midnight fire. She had prepared the fuel that morning, bundles of twisted grass and dried sunflower stalks, stacked beside the firebox, enough for 3 days. If she was careful, enough for 5 days, if she was desperate. She fed the bundles into the firebox one at a time, building the heat gradually, letting the flames reach their peak before adding the next one. 20 minutes. The fire roared. The clay absorbed. The temperature inside the cabin climbed from 49 to 53 degrees. Then the fire died, and the clay took over. At 2 in the morning, Fritz's fever reached 101. Katrin sat beside him in the dark, her hand on his forehead counting his breaths, the way she had once counted bricks methodically, steadily, each number a small prayer. 22 breaths per minute. Too fast. The cough came every few minutes now, deep and wet and exhausting, each one leaving him weaker than the one before. She melted snow in the iron pot that sat on the ledge built into the stove. A small shelf of clay designed for exactly this purpose, for heating water or warming food, without needing to light a separate fire. The water came to a steam, and she let it cool until it was warm, just warm enough to drink without burning. And she pressed the cup to Fritz's lips and tipped small amounts into his mouth, whispering to him in German words that she did not choose, but that came from somewhere old and automatic. The same words her mother had whispered to her when she was sick, the same words her grandmother had whispered to her mother, words passed down through generations of women who had kept children alive through fevers and plagues and winters that tried to end them. Drink, little one. The warmth is your friend. Let it help you fight. At 4 a.m, she lit another fire. 20 minutes. The clay recharged. The temperature climbed back to 52. At dawn, the storm was still raging. Through the oiled paper window, Katrin could see nothing but white. Not the white of snow on the ground or clouds in the sky, but a solid uniform white as though the entire cabin had been submerged in milk. The wind had not decreased. If anything, it was louder, carrying a new frequency, a higher pitch, as though the storm were tightening around them like a fist. Fritz's fever climbed to 103. He began to speak. Not to Katrine, not to his sisters, but to people who were not in the room. His father, his grandmother, his uncle Friedrich, for whom he had been named a man who had died in Ukraine years before Fritz was born. He spoke to them in German, rapid and disconnected fragments of sentences that mixed memory with invention, that combined real events with impossible ones, that placed his dead father beside him on the warm floor and asked him questions that would never be answered. "Papa, when are we getting the horse? You said a bay horse with the white blaze, like Mr. Dawson's. Papa, it is warm here. Did Mama make it warm? Papa, I am tired. Can we go home?" Katrin listened. She kept her hand on his forehead and listened to her son speak to ghosts. And she felt the tears on her face but did not wipe them, because wiping would have required removing her hand from his skin, and she was not willing to do that. Not now. Not while his body was burning at 103 degrees, and his mind was wandering through rooms that existed only in fever. At noon, she lit another fire. At 6 p.m, another. 40 pounds of fuel burned since midnight. The stove consumed it and held it and gave it back steady and patient, an engine of stored warmth that did not waver, did not fluctuate, did not betray. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 32 below zero. Inside, the thermometer that Katrine had bought in Freeman for 15 cents read 51 degrees, 51 degrees, in a tar paper cabin, in a blizzard, at 32 below. The stove was doing what Oma Brigitte had said it would do. The clay was remembering the fire the way clay has always remembered fire. The way it remembered in Ukraine and Russia and Germany and every cold place where people had learned that the earth itself was the best insulation, the best storage, the best defense against the killing cold. But Fritz was still burning. The second night was the longest of Katrine's life. The fever did not break. It held at 103, then crept to 103.5. And each tenth of a degree felt like a step in the wrong direction, a small surrender that the body was making without consent. Fritz stopped speaking to ghosts. He stopped speaking at all. He lay on the warm floor with his eyes half closed and his breathing rapid and shallow, and his lips dry and cracked. And the only sound he made was the cough coming now at intervals so regular that Katrine could time them every 90 seconds. a deep, rattling expulsion that shook his entire body and left him limp. Katrin did not sleep. She sat beside him and held his hand and fed him water drop by drop and changed the warm cloths on his forehead and listened to his breathing and counted the intervals between coughs and watched the stove and watched the window and watched the storm and waited. At some point during the night, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Liesel. The girl was standing behind her barefoot on the warm floor, her face pale in the lamplight, her eyes steady. "Mama," she said, "you need to sleep. I cannot. You have not slept since yesterday morning. You are shaking." Katrin looked at her hands. They were trembling, not from cold, from exhaustion, from the sustained effort of holding still, while everything inside her wanted to scream. "If I sleep, who watches him?" "I do." Katrin looked at her daughter, 11 years old, a child who had carried clay and mixed mortar and laid bricks, and stood in the rain and held her mother's hand in the dark, and never once asked whether any of it would work, because asking would have meant admitting that it might not. "You are a child, Liesel. I know how to feel a forehead. I know how to give water. I know how to put wood in the fire. Grass. We burn grass. I know how to put grass in the fire." Katrin stared at her. The lamp flickered. Fritz coughed. Outside, the wind howled. And inside, an 11-year-old girl was standing with her shoulders straight and her chin up, volunteering to take a watch that grown men would have found daunting. 2 hours, Katrine said. "Wake me if anything changes. Anything." "I will." Katrine lay down on the floor 3 feet from Fritz, close enough to hear his breathing. She closed her eyes. Sleep came instantly, not gently, not gradually, but like a trapdoor opening, dropping her into a darkness so complete that it was indistinguishable from oblivion. Liesel sat in her mother's place. She put her hand on Fritz's forehead, the way she had watched Katrine do it 100 times, hot. She dipped the cloth in warm water and pressed it against his skin. She counted his breaths. She watched the stove. 2 hours passed. Liesel did not wake her mother. She gave her 3. The 3rd morning, Katrine woke to silence, not true silence. The wind was still there, but diminished, reduced from a scream to a moan, a sound that suggested exhaustion rather than fury, as though the storm itself was running out of the energy to continue. The light through the window was different, brighter, carrying in it the cold blue of clearing sky. She sat up. Fritz lay beside the stove exactly where she had left him. The blankets were tucked tight. The warm cloth was folded neatly on his forehead. A cup of water sat beside him half empty. She looked at Liesel, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, with her back against the wall. Awake, her eyes hollow with fatigue but alert. "His fever," Katrine said. "It went up at midnight. Then it came down at 3. I gave him water. He drank some. The cough is less." Katrin put her hand on Fritz's forehead. Warm, not hot. Warm. The kind of warm that belongs on a child's skin. The kind that means the body is working at its proper temperature. The kind that signals not crisis but recovery. Not surrender, but victory. The fever had broken. Katrin did not move. She kept her hand on her son's forehead and felt the warmth that was now the right warmth, the healthy warmth. And she felt something break inside her as well, something that had been holding since August. A tension strung so tight across every muscle and every thought and every waking moment that she had forgotten it was there. Until it snapped. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against the whitewashed wall of the stove. The clay was warm against her skin, steady, patient, constant. It had held the heat through 3 days of the worst blizzard in the history of the American frontier, had held it against 32 below zero and 60-mile-an-hour winds, and the kind of cold that killed iron stoves and wood fires and people. It had held because it was built to hold, because the design was sound, because the channels worked, because the proportions were right, because a woman in Ukraine had taught a girl how to build something that the girl had carried across an ocean and a continent and 16 years of doubt. And in the end, the thing she had built was enough. Katrin cried, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, with her forehead pressed against the warm clay, her shoulders shaking, tears running down her face and into the whitewash, leaving small tracks on the smooth surface. She cried for Fritz, who would live. She cried for Johann, who would not. She cried for Oma Brigitte, who had taught her everything and could not be here to see it work. She cried for the Eriksons, who had not been so lucky. She cried for herself, for the months of doubt and labor and fear, for the nights she had lain awake wondering if Edna Dawson was right, if the stove would fail, if she would kill her own children. With her stubbornness and her memory and her mud, she cried until there was nothing left. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve and she stood up, and she lit the morning fire. 20 minutes. The clay recharged, the cabin warmed, and outside very slowly the storm began to let go. By noon on January 15th, the sky was clear. The prairie lay buried under drifts that reached 6 feet in places, smooth and white and featureless. A landscape scrubbed of every familiar marker, every fence post, every path, every evidence of human habitation. The world looked new and blank and enormous, as though the storm had not just covered the land, but erased it, returned it to some original state that existed before people came and tried to make it theirs. Katrin opened the door and stood on the step and breathed air that was clean and motionless and bitterly cold. The thermometer read 22 below. The sky was so blue it hurt to look at. Nothing moved, no wind, no birds. No sound at all except the faint, high ringing of absolute silence, the sound the ear makes when there is nothing else to hear. Inside, the children were alive. Annie's fingers had recovered. The color was normal, the feeling had returned. And though Katrine suspected that the tips of 2 fingers on her left hand would always be sensitive to cold, the hand would work. The child would keep her fingers. The damage was temporary. Fritz was weak but awake, his fever gone. His cough reduced to a dry, shallow catch that came and went without the terrifying depth it had carried during the storm. He was hungry, which was the surest sign of recovery. Katrine made him broth from the last of the salt pork heated on the stove's warming shelf, and he drank it slowly, sitting on the warm floor, his back against the clay, his eyes clear for the first time in 3 days. Liesel sat beside the window, looking out at the white world, saying nothing. The rescue party arrived at noon. There were 4 of them. Lars Eriksson and 3 others riding horses that struggled through the drifts, their breath coming in great white plumes, their faces wrapped in scarves so thick that only their eyes were visible. They had been riding since dawn, visiting homesteads along the creek road, checking on the living and counting the dead. The count was not good. They had found the Mortensen family, all 5 of them frozen in their beds. They had found old Peder Johansson in his barn, sitting against the wall beside his last cow. Both of them rigid, both of them still. They had found a young schoolteacher named Fiona Albrecht, wandering on the prairie 2 miles from the schoolhouse, blind from the snow. Her hands frozen past, saving alive but barely carried back to Freeman on the back of a horse, while she muttered apologies to children who were not there. So when they crested the ridge and saw the Steinhardt cabin sitting in its ocean of white snow, with no smoke rising from the chimney, no tracks in the yard, no sign of life of any kind, Eriksson did not even slow his horse. He simply nodded to the others and said what he had been saying all morning at every dark, smokeless cabin they had approached. Dig out the door. They dug. They expected the worst. They had seen enough of the worst that morning to last them several lifetimes. The door opened, and the warm air came out. Eriksson would later describe it to his wife as the strangest moment of his life. The air that hit his frozen face was not just warm. It was alive, carrying in it the smell of bread baking in clay, holding heat and children breathing steadily in a room that had no right to be warm, no right to be habitable, no right to contain anything but death. He stepped inside. His boots met the warm floor. His eyes found the white mass of the stove, gleaming in the dim light, radiating a heat so steady and so gentle that it felt less like a machine and more like a presence, a living thing that had been set to the task of keeping 4 people alive, and had done so without complaint, without failure, without interruption. The children looked up at him. Fritz, thin and pale but alive. Annie, pink-cheeked and bright-eyed. Liesel, composed and watchful, already standing, already evaluating this stranger, with the careful assessment of a child who had learned during the storm that not all adults could be trusted to save you, and Katrin standing beside the stove with flour on her hands, and a calm in her eyes that Eriksson would never forget, the calm of a woman who had walked into the white and come back, who had held a dying child and brought him through, who had built a stove from mud and memory, and had bet everything on it, and won. He took off his glove. He placed his bare hand against the whitewashed clay. The warmth entered his palm and traveled up his arm, and settled somewhere behind his ribs, in the place where wonder lives when it catches you unprepared. "How?" he whispered. Katrin looked at him. She understood the question, though her English was still imperfect. She understood it because it was the same question everyone had been asking since August. The same question that had lived in Silas Dawson's eyes and Edna Dawson's voice and Colton Whitfield's notebook. The same question asked now with reverence instead of doubt. She placed her own hand on the stove beside his. "My grandmother taught me," she said. 3 days passed. The prairie began the slow, painful process of accounting. Riders went out in every direction carrying lists of names returning with shorter lists. The dead were gathered and stored in barns and sheds because the ground was too frozen to dig graves and would remain so until April. The living gathered in Freeman and spoke in low voices about wind speeds and temperatures and the number of hours between the moment the storm hit and the moment the iron stoves went cold, which for most families was between 8 and 14 hours. After that darkness, after that the burning of furniture, after that prayer, after that for some silence. On the 18th of January, Katrine heard footsteps in the yard. Not hooves, footsteps. Slow, heavy, uneven, the footsteps of people walking through deep snow on legs that were not sure they could carry the weight. She went to the door. Silas and Edna Dawson stood in the yard. They had walked 6 miles through drifts that reached their waists, 6 miles in sub-zero cold, 6 miles that must have taken them most of the day. They were gray. Not just their faces, not just their clothes, but their entire beings gray with cold and exhaustion. And something else. Something that lived behind their eyes like a light that had been turned down until it barely flickered. Edna's hands were wrapped in strips of cloth. The wrapping was stained with something dark. Frostbite. The kind that meant blackened fingertips and weeks of pain and the possibility of losing parts that would not grow back. Their son, a boy of 14 whom Katrine had never met, stood behind them shaking so hard that his teeth made a clicking sound audible from 10 feet away. Silas spoke first. His voice was hoarse, reduced to a whisper by cold, and by something heavier than cold. "Our stove went out," he said, 12 hours after the storm started. The wood was stacked outside, 20 feet from the door. Might as well have been 20 miles. He paused, swallowed. "We burned the chairs first, then the table, then the floorboards. Margaret pulled them up with her bare hands, while I held the children." He looked at his wife's wrapped hands. "When the floorboards were gone, we started on the door frame. We would have burned the walls if the storm had lasted another day." He stepped toward the cabin. The warmth reached him at the threshold, and he stopped, and something crossed his face that was more than relief. Something closer to grief. The grief of a man who had spent 30 years on the prairie, believing he understood it, and had just learned in the hardest possible way that he did not. He walked to the stove. He placed his hand on the whitewashed clay. He closed his eyes. "I thought I understood winter," he said, "but I did not." Then he turned to Katrine. His voice was unsteady. "I could have built something before the storm. You offered. I did not listen." Katrin shook her head gently. "You did not offer," she said, "but it does not matter. It matters to me. Then remember it, and it will not happen again." Silas nodded. He kept his hand on the stove. He did not seem able to let go. Edna had not spoken. She stood near the door, her wrapped hands held against her chest, her eyes moving slowly around the cabin, taking in the warm floor, the sleeping children, the stove, the smell of bread, all the evidence of a survival that she had predicted would not happen. All the proof that the woman she had warned, the woman whose child she had offered to take, the woman she had told would kill her own children, had done what Edna herself could not do. She looked at Katrine. The two women regarded each other across the small, warm room. Between them lay months of words, warnings given and rejected, judgments made and proven wrong, the particular pain of one woman telling another that she is not enough, and then discovering that she was wrong, that the other woman was not just enough, but more than enough, and that the lesson in humility was coming at the cost of frozen fingers and burned furniture, and a 6-mile walk through the snow. "Will you teach me?" Edna asked. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the authority it had carried in September, stripped of everything except the question itself. "Will you teach me to build one of these?" Katrin looked at her. She saw the pain in Edna's eyes, the genuine pain not just physical, but the deeper pain of a woman confronting the gap between what she believed and what was true. She saw the wrapped hands, and the gray face, and the exhaustion, and the fear. And behind all of it, behind the pride, and the judgment and the prophecy, she saw something that she recognized because she carried it herself. A mother trying to keep her children alive. "Yes," Katrin said. "I will teach you." The news traveled. By the end of January, families came from 10 miles, 20 miles, some from as far as Sioux Falls, riding through the frozen prairie to stand in a tar paper cabin and press their hands against a whitewashed clay stove and feel the warmth that had survived the worst blizzard any of them had ever seen. They came with notebooks. They came with measuring strings. They came with the particular humility of people who have been forced to admit that they do not know everything, and that the stranger they dismissed might know something essential. They traced the smoke channels with their fingers. They asked about the clay mixture, the straw ratio, the angle of the turns. They knelt beside the firebox and looked inside at the hard-fired brick lining. They touched the warm floor and looked at each other with expressions that said the same thing without words. We should have listened. No one called it foreign superstition anymore. No one called it a mud stove. They called it what it was: salvation. In February, Colton Whitfield returned. He came in a buggy this time, which meant the roads had been cleared, which meant the world was beginning to reassemble itself after the storm. He wore his good coat and carried his leather notebook and had the expression of a man who is about to do something that costs him nothing but that he will present as though it costs him everything. He circled the stove. He wrote in his notebook. He examined the walls, the roof, the floor. He examined the 3 children who were healthy and clean and dressed in mended but adequate clothing. He examined the stacks of twisted grass fuel piled neatly beside the firebox, enough for another month. He closed the notebook. Adequate improvements, he said. Valid claim. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge that he had once declared these improvements inadequate, that he had recommended relocation, that he had looked at this woman and her mud bricks and seen failure. He simply recorded the opposite of what he had recorded 6 months ago, and tucked the notebook into his coat and touched the brim of his hat. Katrin watched him go. She did not need his apology. She needed his signature, and she had it, and that was enough. Spring came. The snow melted. The prairie turned green and then gold, and then brown, cycling through its seasons the way it always had and always would, indifferent to the people who tried to live on it, but not unkind, offering grass and clay and water and sunlight to anyone willing to do the work of turning those things into survival. Carpenters came from Freeman. Brickmakers came from the Mennonite settlements south of town. They studied Katrine's stove and built others first for the Dawsons, then for families across Turner County, then for homesteaders as far north as Huron and as far west as the Missouri Breaks. The design spread the way all essential knowledge spreads not through books or lectures or institutions, but through hands, through the touching of warm clay, through the passing of skill from one person to the next. The same way it had spread for centuries, on the steppes of Ukraine and Russia and Germany. The same way it had always spread the way Oma Brigitte had spread it to Katrine, and Katrine was now spreading it to a new country. Old knowledge crossing an ocean. Old knowledge crossing a prairie. Old knowledge crossing the particular stubborn wall of pride that makes people believe that new is always better and foreign is always wrong. Katrin proved up her homestead in 1892. She married again a quiet farmer named Henrik Graff, who understood that the stove in the center of the house was not to be touched, not to be modified, not to be replaced. They had 2 more children. The farm grew slowly. The land produced. The stove lasted 40 years. 40 years of 20-minute fires and 20-hour heat. 40 years of warm floors and warm walls, and children sleeping against the clay. 40 years of Dakota winters met and survived and outlasted by a mass of earth and straw, and memory built by a woman who had nothing but knowledge and the will to use it. When the stove was finally replaced in 1927 by a modern coal furnace, Katrine's eldest grandchild removed a single brick from the structure before the rest was demolished. He cleaned it and placed it on the mantelpiece of the new fireplace, where it sat for decades. A small rectangle of reddish-brown clay, unremarkable to anyone who did not know its story, extraordinary to anyone who did. Katrin Steinhardt died on March 14, 1934. She was 79 years old. She died in her bed, in the house that stood where the tar paper cabin had once stood, in the room where the stove had once stood on a night that was cold, but not as cold as the night she had survived 46 years earlier, with 3 children and a rope and a memory of her grandmother's hands. Her gravestone in the Freeman Cemetery bears a simple inscription in German. Sie wusste, wie man sich warm hält. She knew how to keep warm. Today, the prairie barely remembers her name. The old cabin is gone. The stove is gone. The creek where she dug clay has shifted its course. The Dawson farm is a grain elevator. The Erickson homestead is an empty field. The land office where Colton Whitfield stamped her papers is a parking lot. But something remains. Every winter storm that descends from Alberta and sweeps across the northern plains. Every family that gathers in a warm house while the wind howls outside. Every time old knowledge saves a life that new knowledge could not. Every time a woman builds something that no one believes in, and it works. Something of Katrine Steinhardt is in that moment, in that warmth, in that stubborn refusal to accept that the math does not add up when you know in your hands and your bones and your memory that it does. Sometimes the best solutions are not invented. They are inherited. Sometimes the strongest shelter is built from memory, and sometimes the poorest widow on the prairie becomes the teacher that everyone else should have listened to all along. She had no wood, no coal, no proper stove, no chance, they all said. And yet, when the worst cold in the history of the American frontier came to kill them, the floor beneath her children stayed warm at 40 below zero. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything